It was a beautiful morning, and Margaret had no reason to think anything was different. She and Linda were walking through the community park, just as they had done many times before. The path was wide and level. No stairs, no hill, no loose gravel, nothing blocking their way. Linda was talking about her grandson, and Margaret was laughing. Then, in the middle of a sentence, Margaret stopped. Linda took 2 more steps before she noticed. She turned around. Margaret! Margaret was looking down at her feet. For a moment she said nothing. Linda walked back. "Are you all right?" Margaret looked up and gave her a small smile. "I'm fine." She glanced at the path ahead, then back at her feet. "I just wasn't sure for a second." "About what?" Margaret hesitated. "The next step." Linda looked ahead. There was nothing there. No curb. No crack. No obstacle. Just a smooth walking path stretching beneath the trees. Margaret had walked this same path before. She knew every turn. She knew the bench near the fountain. She knew where the morning sun came through the branches. And yet, for one quiet moment, her body had been ready to move, while something inside her had said, "Wait." Linda didn't rush her. She didn't say, "You're getting old." She didn't say, "You shouldn't worry about it." She simply stood beside her. After a few seconds, Margaret took a step, then another. Soon the 2 women were walking again. They returned to their conversation. They laughed once more. From the outside, nothing had happened, but Margaret kept thinking about that moment. Not because she had fallen. She hadn't. Not because her legs hurt. They didn't. And not because she suddenly felt weak. She didn't. What bothered her was something much harder to explain. Why had she needed a moment to trust a step she had taken thousands of times? For many older adults, moments like this can be easy to dismiss. A pause before moving. A hand reaching for something nearby. A slower turn. A little more attention paid to where the feet are going. Sometimes these changes are simply part of getting older. Sometimes they can have many different causes, and a new or significant change in walking deserves proper medical attention. But there is another question worth asking. What if the hesitation is not always about whether the legs can move? What if sometimes the brain is asking for a little more certainty before it allows the body to move with confidence? Margaret didn't know the answer that morning. Linda didn't either. And neither of them realized that this tiny interruption on an ordinary walk would lead to a much bigger question about aging, movement, and trust. Because sometimes the most important changes in our bodies don't announce themselves with pain. They arrive quietly. In the extra second before a step. In the hand that reaches for support. In the moment when something familiar suddenly feels just a little less certain. And once Margaret began noticing that extra second, she started seeing it in places she had never thought about before. At the time she thought it was nothing, but the question stayed with her, quietly waiting for an answer she would soon discover in an unexpected place. After that morning in the park, Margaret didn't suddenly become afraid of walking. She simply began noticing things she had never thought about before. The first happened when she stepped out of her car at the grocery store. She closed the door, reached for her bag and started toward the entrance. Then she slowed. There was nothing unusual about the sidewalk. No stairs. No puddle. No broken pavement. Still, Margaret looked down for just a moment before taking her next step. It was such a small thing that she almost laughed at herself. Then she forgot about it. Until later that afternoon. She was standing in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for dinner, when she turned to reach for something on the counter behind her. She stopped halfway through the turn. For one brief second, she wanted to make sure her feet were firmly planted before changing direction. Again, nothing hurt. She wasn't dizzy. She wasn't falling. She simply wanted to feel certain. That word stayed with her. Certain. A few days later, Margaret walked across the parking lot after visiting the farmer's market. The afternoon light was changing, and long shadows stretched across the pavement. She noticed herself slowing slightly as she moved from one patch of sunlight into another. She knew the ground was flat. She knew where she was going. But her eyes checked the surface before her feet continued. Another tiny moment. Another moment that would have been easy to ignore. And then there was the garden. Margaret loved her garden because it had always felt familiar. She knew where every rose bush stood. She knew which stones were loose after rain. She knew exactly where the grass became softer near the flower beds. One morning, as she stepped from the path onto the grass, she paused. The ground felt a little different beneath her shoes. Not dangerous. Just different. She looked down. Then she took the step. That was when Margaret began to wonder if all these moments were connected. None of them had been dramatic. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't lost her balance. She hadn't suddenly become unable to walk. Her legs still carried her through the grocery store. They still took her around the garden. They still brought her from the kitchen to the front porch and back again. So why did she sometimes feel the need to check first? Why did a simple turn sometimes require an extra moment? Why did her feet seem to wait for a quiet signal before moving on? Margaret thought about the footprints she left behind when she walked through the garden after watering the flowers. One footprint. Then another. She had never thought about how much information might be gathered between those two steps. The surface. The distance. The light. The position of her body. The movement around her. All of it happened so quickly that she had never noticed. Now she was beginning to notice the pause. And she wondered whether that pause meant her legs were becoming weaker, or whether something else was happening first. A few days later, Linda came over. Margaret mentioned the moments almost casually. Linda listened. Then she smiled. "You know," she said, "I do that too." Margaret looked at her. "You do?" Linda nodded. "Sometimes I slow down before I even know why." The two women laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. And for the first time, Margaret realized she might not be the only one. Maybe there were thousands of people her age who had experienced the same tiny hesitation. A moment so small that nobody talked about it. A moment that didn't look like weakness. But perhaps those small moments were telling a story. And Margaret was beginning to wonder what that story was. A few days later, Margaret mentioned the moments to Emily. It happened naturally, while the two of them were putting away groceries in the kitchen. Emily had noticed small changes too. Nothing dramatic. Her mother was still gardening. She still drove herself to the market. She still prepared meals, watered the roses, and walked through the neighborhood. But Emily remembered seeing her pause sometimes before turning, or look down before stepping onto a different surface, or reach for the back of a chair before she actually needed it. Emily placed a carton of milk on the counter. "Mom, do you think your legs are getting weaker?" Margaret stopped for a moment. "I don't think so." Emily smiled gently. "Maybe it's just something that happens as we get older." Margaret nodded. "Maybe." But neither of them sounded completely convinced. So when Margaret had a routine visit with Dr. Carter a few days later, Emily mentioned it. Dr. Carter listened without interrupting. He didn't immediately talk about aging. He didn't tell Margaret that she was simply getting weaker. And he didn't turn the conversation into a list of exercises. Instead, he asked Margaret a question. "When you hesitate." He paused. "Do your legs actually fail you?" Margaret thought about it. "No." "Do you fall?" "No." "Do you feel pain?" "Not really." Dr. Carter nodded. "Then let me ask you something different." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "When you hesitate, could it be that your brain simply wants a little more certainty before you make the next movement?" Margaret looked at him. Emily did too. For a moment, neither woman answered. The question sounded simple. But it changed the way Margaret thought about everything that had happened during the past few weeks. The pause in the park. The garden hose. The uneven grass. The shadows across the parking lot. None of those moments had meant that her legs had stopped working. Her legs had still been capable of moving. What had changed, perhaps, was the amount of information her brain wanted before allowing her to move with confidence. Dr. Carter continued gently. "Think about driving a familiar road." Margaret smiled. "I know that road." Exactly, he said. You don't think about every single movement. But if the weather changes, the road becomes unfamiliar, or something suddenly appears ahead, you naturally become more careful. Margaret nodded slowly. You're saying my brain may be doing something similar? It can be one way to think about it, Dr. Carter said. He didn't give her a diagnosis. He gave her a different question. And sometimes a better question can change the way we understand an experience. Margaret had arrived wondering whether her legs were becoming weak. She left thinking about something else entirely. Maybe the most interesting part wasn't whether her legs could still move. Maybe it was understanding how her brain decided when it was safe to trust that movement. And for Margaret, that question was just beginning. Dr. Carter did not give Margaret a complicated explanation. Instead, he asked her to imagine a piano. Imagine you have a beautiful piano in your home, he said. Margaret smiled. My mother had one. Then you know what I mean. He continued. You dust it. You polish the wood. You keep the room warm. You make sure nothing damages it. Margaret nodded. But imagine that nobody sits down to play it. For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Dr. Carter continued. Week after week, the piano remains there. It hasn't disappeared. The keys are still there. The strings are still there. The instrument hasn't suddenly become broken. He paused. But when someone finally sits down and begins to play again, they may not move across those keys with the same confidence they once had. Margaret looked thoughtful. They might take a little more time. Exactly. Dr. Carter smiled. And that is one way to think about movement. Margaret looked at him. He explained that walking is not simply a matter of having strong muscles and telling the legs to move. Every step involves information. The eyes notice the surface ahead. The feet sense what is underneath them. The body knows where it is in relation to the ground. The brain takes in all of those signals and uses them to help guide the next movement. Most of the time, this happens so quickly that we never notice it. We simply walk. But when something feels unfamiliar, uncertain, or less predictable, the brain may become more cautious. The movement doesn't necessarily disappear. The confidence behind the movement can change. Margaret thought about the morning in the park. The path had been flat. Her legs had been capable. But for that brief moment, she had needed something more than physical ability. She had needed certainty. Dr. Carter picked up a small object from his desk and placed it in front of her. Think about reaching for something on a table, he said. If you know exactly where it is, you don't think twice. Margaret nodded. But if the room is dark, or the object has been moved, you slow down. You look first. Exactly. He wasn't saying that Margaret's brain had stopped working. Quite the opposite. Her brain was constantly gathering information. Sometimes being cautious was simply part of how the brain responded when it wasn't completely certain about what came next. Margaret leaned back in her chair. So my brain isn't necessarily saying, you can't do this. Dr. Carter smiled. It may simply be saying, let's make sure first. That sentence stayed with Margaret. Let's make sure first. She realized how different that sounded from the thought she had carried into the appointment. She had been quietly wondering whether her legs were failing her. But perhaps she had been asking the wrong question. Maybe the better question was, what is my brain noticing before I take the next step? Later that afternoon, Margaret found herself thinking about the piano again. A piano doesn't become useless simply because a player pauses before touching the keys. And a person doesn't become incapable simply because the brain takes an extra moment to gather information. The goal isn't to ignore that caution. It isn't to force the body forward. It is to understand what the body and brain are communicating, and to keep giving everyday movement a meaningful place in life. That evening, Margaret walked through her garden. She reached the edge of the grass. She looked down. Then she looked ahead. For the first time, she noticed how much information she was taking in without even realizing it. The light. The ground. The position of her feet. The distance to the flower bed. She took the step. Nothing dramatic happened. And perhaps that was the point. The brain had been working quietly all along. Margaret just hadn't noticed it before. A few days later, Margaret and Linda went grocery shopping together. It was one of those ordinary errands that had become part of Margaret's weekly rhythm. They moved slowly through the produce section, comparing tomatoes, choosing apples, and talking about what they might make for dinner. Margaret pushed the cart with one hand. She felt fine. The store wasn't especially crowded. The aisles were familiar. The floor was smooth beneath her shoes. For a while she hardly thought about walking at all. Then they reached the wider aisle near the front of the store. A few shoppers were moving in different directions. Someone stepped out from a side aisle. Another person stopped with a cart directly ahead. A child moved quickly past them. Nothing dangerous. Nothing unusual. But Margaret slowed. Her hand tightened slightly around the handle of the cart. She waited for a small opening. Then she moved forward. Linda noticed. She didn't say anything. She simply walked beside her. A few seconds later, the aisle opened again. Margaret relaxed her hand. The cart continued rolling. They kept walking. At the checkout, Linda placed a few items onto the conveyor belt. Margaret stood beside her. Then Linda looked over. "You did it again." Margaret smiled. "Did what?" "You slowed down." Margaret thought for a moment. "I suppose I did. You seemed perfectly fine." "I was." Linda raised an eyebrow. "So why did you slow down?" Margaret laughed softly. "I don't know." Then she remembered something. "Actually." She paused. "Maybe I do." She told Linda about her conversation with Dr. Carter. About the piano. About how the brain takes in information before the body moves. About how something unfamiliar can make a person more cautious, even when the muscles themselves are still capable of doing the job. Linda listened carefully. "So you think your brain saw all those people moving around and decided to be careful?" Margaret nodded. "That's what I'm beginning to think." She looked back toward the crowded aisle. "It wasn't telling me I couldn't walk." She smiled. "It was telling me to make sure first." Linda nodded. "And you listened?" "Yes." Margaret thought about that. For years she had imagined confidence as something simple. You either had it or you didn't. But perhaps movement wasn't quite that simple. Sometimes confidence depended on the environment around you. A quiet sidewalk felt different from a crowded store. A familiar garden felt different from an unfamiliar floor. Bright morning light felt different from long shadows. And the brain noticed those differences, even when Margaret didn't consciously think about them. That afternoon, as they carried the groceries toward the car, Margaret noticed something else. She wasn't embarrassed about slowing down. She wasn't angry with herself. And she wasn't thinking, "My legs are getting weak." She was thinking, "My brain noticed something, and I gave myself a moment to respond." That small change in the way she interpreted the moment felt surprisingly important. Because if every pause meant weakness, she might begin to fear the pauses. But if some pauses were simply the brain asking for more information, perhaps she could respond with patience instead of fear. Margaret placed the groceries in the trunk. Linda closed the cart. The two women walked toward the car together. This time Margaret didn't think about whether she was walking fast enough. She simply noticed the ground beneath her feet and kept going. A few mornings later, Margaret and Linda returned to the community garden. The paths were familiar now. Margaret knew where the rose beds began, where the benches sat beneath the trees, and where the walking path changed from smooth pavement to packed earth. They walked side by side, talking about the flowers that had started blooming earlier than expected. For a while, Margaret didn't think about her walking at all. Then the path disappeared briefly beneath the moving shadows of the trees. Sunlight and shade shifted across the ground with every movement of the branches. Margaret slowed for half a second. She looked down. Then ahead. Linda noticed. "Checking the ground again?" Margaret smiled. "I suppose I am." She took another step. Then another. And this time, instead of feeling frustrated by the pause, she became curious about it. She remembered something Dr. Carter had said. The brain isn't simply sending a message that says, "Move your leg." It is constantly receiving information. What do the eyes see? What does the ground feel like beneath the feet? Where is the body positioned? How quickly is the body moving? Is anything changing nearby? Most of the time, all of this happens without conscious thought. We don't stop to analyze every step. We simply walk. But Margaret was beginning to understand that every ordinary step was actually a quiet conversation between different parts of the body and the brain. She remembered Dr. Carter's piano. A musician doesn't simply press a key because someone told them to. They listen. They feel. They adjust. They respond to what is happening in the moment. Movement can work in a similar way. The brain gathers information from the body and the surroundings, then helps coordinate the next movement. And when the information feels less certain, the body may naturally slow down while the brain gathers more information. Margaret looked at the path ahead. A patch of sunlight. A patch of shade. A few small leaves scattered across the ground. Nothing dangerous. Nothing she needed to fear. But she could see how different the surface looked from one moment to the next. She took another step. This time she didn't force herself to move faster. She simply looked ahead, felt the ground beneath her shoes, and allowed the movement to happen naturally. Linda walked beside her. "You look more relaxed," she said. Margaret smiled. "I think I'm paying attention without worrying." That distinction mattered. For a long time, Margaret had assumed that paying closer attention meant something was wrong. Now she was beginning to see that awareness and fear were not the same thing. She could notice the ground without being afraid of it. She could slow down without believing she was weak. She could give herself a moment without turning that moment into a diagnosis. And perhaps most importantly, she could keep moving. They reached the end of the garden path. Margaret turned toward Linda. "You know what I find interesting?" "What?" "I used to think walking was something my legs did." Linda smiled. "And now?" Margaret looked down at the path. "Now I think my whole body has something to say about it." Linda laughed. "That's a lot of responsibility for one walk." Margaret laughed too. Then the two women continued toward the garden gate. The conversation moved on. But Margaret carried a different understanding with her. Her brain wasn't simply deciding whether her legs were strong enough. It was constantly asking what the environment was telling it. And sometimes, when the answer wasn't immediately clear, a little caution could appear before the next step. That didn't automatically mean something was failing. It meant there was information to consider. And once Margaret understood that, she stopped treating every small pause as something to fear. She began treating it as a moment to notice. Then when she felt ready, she took the next step. Confidence did not return to Margaret all at once. There was no morning when she woke up and suddenly felt completely different. Instead, it came back in small moments, almost too small to notice. One Saturday morning, Margaret was in her garden with Linda. A basket of freshly picked vegetables sat on the ground beside them. Margaret reached down, picked it up, and carried it toward the kitchen. It wasn't heavy. She could have carried it easily before. But this time she noticed something different. She didn't think about whether she could do it. She simply did it. Linda walked beside her. She didn't say, "Good job." She didn't tell Margaret to be careful. She simply walked at the same pace. That afternoon, Margaret watered the roses. She moved around the garden, stepping over the familiar hose without stopping to think about it. Later, she carried a few plates from the kitchen to the dining room. Again, nothing remarkable happened. And perhaps that was what made these moments remarkable. Margaret was beginning to notice how often she could move without questioning every movement. A few days later, Emily came by with Sophie. Sophie wanted Margaret to come outside and see something she had found near the flower beds. Margaret followed her. Sophie walked quickly, then stopped, turned around, and reached for her grandmother's hand. Margaret took it. They walked together toward the garden. For a moment, Margaret watched their hands. An older hand. A younger hand. Two people moving at completely different speeds but still going in the same direction. Margaret smiled. She realized that she wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't trying to walk like she had at 50. She wasn't trying to ignore the moments when she needed to slow down. She was simply learning
Look,
to move with
Margaret,
more
a
awareness and less
butterfly.
fear. And that difference
Beautiful,
mattered.
isn't it?
She remembered something
Grandma,
Dr. Carter had told her.
butterfly.
The goal wasn't to force herself through every hesitation. It was to
wow,
understand what
it's
her body and brain were
beautiful.
telling her, and to give herself opportunities to move in ways that felt safe and meaningful. So Margaret kept living. She walked with Linda. She worked in her garden. She carried her vegetables. She moved around her kitchen. She played with Sophie. None of these things looked like exercise, but they were all opportunities to use the movements that belonged to her everyday life. And slowly, Margaret began noticing something. The movements that once made her pause did not always feel quite so unfamiliar anymore. Not perfect. Not effortless every time. Just more familiar. More natural. More hers. One evening, Linda sat with Margaret on the front porch. "You seem different," Linda said. Margaret thought about it. "I don't think my legs suddenly became stronger." Linda smiled. "Then what changed?" Margaret looked out toward the garden. "Maybe I stopped assuming that every little hesitation meant something was wrong." Linda nodded. "And?" Margaret smiled. "Maybe I started trusting myself again." There was no dramatic transformation. No promise that every future step would be easy. And Margaret understood that if walking ever changed suddenly, became significantly more difficult, or came with other concerning symptoms, she should talk with her doctor rather than simply assume it was part of aging. But for now, she had learned something important. Confidence didn't always come from pushing harder. Sometimes it came from paying attention, from moving regularly through the life you already have, from allowing ordinary activities to remind your brain and body that movement still belongs to you. Margaret looked at Linda. "Maybe confidence isn't about never hesitating." Linda smiled. "Then what is it?" Margaret looked toward Sophie playing among the flowers. "Maybe it's knowing you can pause." She took a breath. "And still take the next step." The next morning, Margaret returned to the community garden with Linda. The air was cool and long shadows stretched beneath the trees. They had been walking for several minutes when they reached a familiar section of the garden path. The pavement ended there. A narrow strip of packed earth connected it to the next part of the walkway. It wasn't steep or dangerous, but the ground was slightly uneven from the rain. Margaret stopped for a moment. Linda stopped too. Neither woman said anything. Margaret looked down at the ground. Then she remembered Dr. Carter's words. "Your brain is constantly gathering information before it decides how much confidence to give a movement." The sentence came back quietly, not as a warning but as something worth remembering. Margaret looked at the ground again. She noticed the darker patch where the soil was still damp. She noticed the small stones near the edge. She noticed where her right foot would land. Then she looked ahead. Margaret placed one foot carefully onto the earth, then the other. She shifted her weight and continued walking. Linda watched her for a moment. "You didn't stop this time." Margaret smiled. "I almost did." She took another step. "But I remembered what Dr. Carter said." They continued down the path. There was no dramatic change. Margaret didn't suddenly walk faster or pretend the ground was perfectly even. She didn't ignore what she was seeing or feeling. She simply gave herself enough time to understand the surface beneath her feet. For Margaret, that difference mattered. She had spent weeks wondering whether every hesitation meant her body was becoming less capable. Now she was beginning to understand that a pause could have another meaning. Sometimes the brain may simply be gathering more information before a movement feels certain. And there was an important difference between noticing that caution and being frightened by it. Margaret remembered another part of her conversation with Dr. Carter. He had never told her to push through every hesitation. He had never told her to ignore a change in the way she walked. Instead, he had encouraged her to pay attention to what was happening, to stay engaged in ordinary movement, and to talk with her doctor if something changed significantly or suddenly. That made sense to her now. She didn't need to prove that she could walk exactly as she had 20 years ago. She needed to understand how she moved today, then give herself opportunities to keep moving safely and confidently. Over the next few weeks, she began noticing small differences. In the garden, she stepped around the hose without making a production of it. At home, She turned toward the kitchen counter without reaching automatically for the chair. When she walked with Linda, she sometimes looked ahead instead of constantly checking her feet. None was dramatic enough to celebrate, but Margaret noticed them. Linda noticed too. One afternoon, they were walking through the garden when Margaret reached a familiar patch of uneven ground. This time she slowed naturally. She looked. She adjusted her step and kept going. She didn't reach for Linda. She didn't search for a railing. She didn't rush. She moved with intention. Linda looked at her and smiled. She said nothing. Margaret appreciated that. She didn't want applause or anyone to tell her she was doing well. She wanted to feel that the movement belonged to her again. As they continued, Margaret thought about Dr. Carter's piano. A piano doesn't become a different instrument because a musician pauses before playing a difficult passage. Sometimes the player simply listens more carefully, feels the keys, finds the rhythm, then continues. Margaret realized that perhaps confidence was not the absence of caution. Perhaps confidence was knowing how to respond when caution appeared. She looked at Linda. I used to think the goal was to never hesitate. Linda waited. Margaret smiled. Now I think the goal is to understand what my body is telling me. She paused. And give myself a chance to move with confidence. Linda nodded. They kept walking. Margaret wasn't trying to become the woman she had been at 50. She was learning to trust the woman she was today. And perhaps that was a different kind of strength. Not louder. Not faster. Just quieter, more aware, and more confident in what came next. A few days later, Margaret and Linda sat together on Margaret's front porch after their morning walk. The walk had been easy. Nothing unusual had happened. They had followed the familiar neighborhood path, talked about the garden, and stopped once to watch a pair of cardinals moving between the trees. Margaret looked relaxed. Linda noticed. You seem more comfortable lately. Margaret smiled. I think I am. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I still pay attention. Linda nodded. But you don't seem worried about every step anymore. Margaret thought about that. Maybe I'm learning the difference. The two women sat quietly for a moment. The morning was moving toward midday. A warm breeze passed through the trees. Linda glanced at her watch. It was almost 10 o'clock. She sighed. You know what's strange? Margaret looked over. What? I felt great when I woke up this morning. Margaret smiled. That's good. I had breakfast. I felt fine. I even thought I was going to have a really productive morning. She took another sip of coffee. But now. She shook her head. My energy is just gone. Margaret raised her eyebrows. Already? Linda laughed. Exactly. Neither woman thought much more about it. But Margaret remembered something. The feeling was familiar. Not weakness. Not illness. Just that strange moment when the morning had started with energy. And somehow, only a few hours later, the desire to sit down had arrived much earlier than expected. Margaret looked at Linda. Does that happen often? Linda smiled. More often than I'd like. Margaret laughed. The conversation moved on. But that small question remained. Because perhaps the body has more than one way of quietly changing how we experience a day. Sometimes it asks us to slow down before the next step. And sometimes just a few hours after breakfast, it seems to take away the energy we thought we had for the entire morning. So why does that happen? Why can someone wake up feeling refreshed, eat what seems like a perfectly ordinary breakfast, and then find themselves reaching for another cup of coffee before 10? Is it simply part of getting older? Or could there be something else happening inside the body? Margaret didn't have the answer yet. Neither did Linda. But the next question had already begun. And this time it wasn't about trusting the legs. It was about understanding where the morning's energy had gone.